tell you a little bit of how Arivell came to be. And so I was a venture capitalist with Howard Schultz here in Seattle, and I led the health and wellness practice. And it was always my goal to back Lee Hood. We targeted people that we wanted to back. And I was fortunate because of Gretchen Sorensen and some other people became friends with Lee over time. So in October of 13, Lee said, Clayton, let's go have dinner. And I'm like, game on. I finally get to back Lee Hood. And so I sit down, and in typical Lee Hood fashion, he goes, Clayton, we're going to change the world. Going to launch the biggest company of my career, and this is going to be transformational. And you're going to be the CEO. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I do have a day job I like, but what a silly honor to be recruited by Lee Hood. And so I said, well, I can be a CEO about 30% of the time for a year. We'll do this IRB-approved study, and then I'll replace myself. And so clearly didn't replace myself, having more fun than I've ever had professionally. But when Lee shared the vision of systems biology, and I thought about everything I'd learned on the consumer side, we know three things about consumers. One, they don't wake up and want to be healthy. That's not their focus. Two, data paralyzes them, but they're out buying tons of data. And three, they're looking for relationships. They're actually extraordinarily lonely. And so I'd been following a company where Jennifer Lovejoy, now our Chief Translational Science Officer, was their Chief Translational Science Officer, really understands the art and science of behavior change and social cognitive theory. So what you see up here is systems biology married with social cognitive theory, and it's the marriage of those two systems that have been driving the results. Jennifer was the first person that Lee and I hired, and we're still so happy today that she agreed to join us. Jennifer has impacted hundreds of thousands of individuals, both in her work in academia and her work in the private sector, in actually changing behavior and bringing the data to life. And maybe to start, Jennifer, if you'd share a little bit about your background and what made Arivell interesting to you and sort of what's different about sort of this inflection point of what you've done prior to Arivell and what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, so I started out life as getting my PhD in physiological psychology. So right away, kind of that systems approach to behavior and biology, and then went into a number of years in academia doing clinical trials related mainly to weight loss and type 2 diabetes and women's health over the years, working at an institute much like ISB. It was a privately funded research institute in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And then came up here to Seattle, still in academia, but joined Free and Clear, the company that Clayton mentioned, where we were at a population level really addressing two of the primary drivers of chronic disease, tobacco use and overweight. And so we had a tobacco cessation program, we had weight loss programs that we offered to governments, to employers, and we're serving hundreds of thousands of people a year using telephone coaching, which prior to that point I had always done face-to-face type coaching trials, and I was astonished at how effective, actually in some cases even more effective, the sort of telephone coaching was for people to be able to get to the heart of problems clinically. So was having a lot of fun, but this idea of really having the data, which we didn't have in a public health setting. We had self-reported data, but we didn't have the biology. But the genetics, the clinical labs, all of the omics that we bring together that allows for the types of personalized medicine that I think many of us in this room have always known is the way to actually do care, to optimize wellness, and to avoid disease is a tremendously unique vision, and one that I've just been delighted to be part of.
Nice. We'd like to ask Lee one question, and then we're going to turn it over to you so that you can ask questions that you're interested in. But Lee, I'm curious, when you and I had that dinner and I sort of raised the idea of, okay, let's bring the data to life for people, and you've really embraced it, but what have been some of the aha moments as you, Nathan, all of us have been building Arivell in terms of the data and the combination of coaching?
You know, I think from day one, we had it all right, except there was one thing that has been difficult, and that's the cost of the assays. I think what that said is, look, you could only bring wellness to people that can afford it, and we want to bring it to everybody. So I think one of the biggest aha moments is we've got to change that. We've got to reduce the cost of the assays tenfold in the next 5 to 10 years, and the way you do that is through technology. And I think Jim Heath coming to ISB is going to be a major facilitator through the technologies he has of being able to reduce the cost of goods, so to say. So I think the whole question is, can we democratize scientific wellness? And the answer is yes, if we handle but I'd say on the other hand, the vision is where medicine is going to go. And the only question is, how long is it going to take? And I think in Airvale, we're determined to make that a short number.
Exactly. Accelerate it. So questions?
So one question I've got is sort of one of the missing legs of the stool, and that is the physician, the private physician, my general practitioner physician. It's like you bring this big pile of data to them and say, look at this, my LDLP is off the roof, and it's like, okay, I know how to deal with LDL concentrations, but not that. And so there's just this issue of that's kind of a weak link in sort of having this information and being able to act on it, because you guys can't act on it. You have to send it to our personal physician to do that. So, comments?
Jennifer or Lee, and then I'll jump into.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it's actually very much the direction that we are now looking. So we are increasingly working with healthcare systems and physician practices. So Lee and Clayton have both spoken about the Providence work that we're doing, but we're also looking now at other health systems and physician practices to actually make scientific wellness a part of what they are doing. So not only will patients just be showing up with the data, but the physicians themselves will have insights into their patients' dashboards. If they want to look at that, we're giving specific training to those physicians on how to interpret the data, and then the coach and the program are really there to support them in their practice. So it's a good point. We end up referring probably somewhere between 40 and 50% of people who come into the program to their providers for follow-up on one or more labs or other issues that we see. So we do need to integrate with physicians.
I would say we're doing two things at ISB in Providence. One, we're going to set up a series of wellness clinics within the hospital. And the enormous advantage they have is they can deliver to their patients and the Airvale patients disease-related actionable possibilities, which in theory anyway, the FDA says consumer-based companies like Airvale cannot deliver. And in fact, they shut down 23andMe for about 9 months over that kind of an issue. So the idea would be, here would be a clinic very much modeled around what Airvale has done, and would be doing things in partnership with Airvale that could take in Airvale members, Airvale pioneers, and give them their disease-related actionable possibilities. But even more, they would be the source of spreading these clinics to other parts of the Providence system. It has 50 hospitals throughout mostly the West Coast. So there's an enormous opportunity for expansion there. And the physicians that would be running these clinics would be 100% in sync with this data-driven vision of bringing actionable possibilities to patients. The second thing that ISB is going to do that's really key is, together with our educational group, we're going to put together a series of modules that will bring to healthcare professionals the vision of what P4 medicine is and what scientific wellness is. And let me give you an example of what Nitin Baliga and his colleagues have done with regard to education. About 8 or 9 years ago, they put together a wonderful series of, I think initially 4 modules on what systems biology is. And it was all built around a microorganism called halobacteria. And the kids, we designed little kits that could be sent out, and they could easily do experiments and come to learn what systems biology is. Now, some 8 or 10 years later, those kits are being used in every state in the US, and they're being used in 37 different countries across the world now. So that's the kind of reach you can have if you do things correctly. And I think with regard to the education, it could be even more global.
Couple just quick insights also what has happened based on the study we shared with you with Providence St. Joseph. St. Jude's just launched a program on Monday where they're funding to put all 700 physicians into the Aravel program and funding it for 2 months. And so far, I think we're at about 150 over the past 3 days. And so interesting in that they saw the first experience going through that study. A couple physicians said, okay, this is actually really meaningful. So now we've got this large cohort in one hospital that's got physicians going through. So there's one case study. Second one, I was invited to give a speech in Grand Rapids. So I've never been to Grand Rapids. Spoke to the Spectrum healthcare system. And I use the same slides that I use here. Like, really, 10% of impact, 18% of the GDP. Look at the impact of the drugs. After I gave that talk, they immediately called and said, we want to launch Aravel with 2 of our practices. So Jennifer was in Grand Rapids last week, and we've launched Aravel with their functional medicine practice and their concierge practice. And so there's some interesting early signals because there's some early adopters that are really curious about how to do this. Did we answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Real quick question, why no urine? You get blood, you get stool, you get spit, why no urine?
Why not urine?
Yeah.
Was that the
Why
question?
not urine? Why don't
Well,
I
we
have to do urine
learned
test?
from the pilot study. When we did the Pioneer 100 study, we were looking at urinary analytes. It turned out that we had absolutely the worst compliance of anything, and I've since talked to providers who said, yeah, there's just, I thought, how hard can it be? It's a first morning void, you do it, you bring it into the lab when you're coming in to get your blood. No, it just isn't something that's easily doable, and 24-hour urine is even worse. So it's a practical matter that it's just too hard for people to comply with doing it.
You know, it's remarkable that stools are easier.
It is. And stools are easier than
It says
the
something
saliva.
about psychology we don't
Yeah.
understand. Yeah.
So I had a question with regards to the way the data is handled on a per patient basis. So I appreciate the need for coaches, but it seems like if you had it be more of a video game kind of thing where someone could immerse themselves in their own data within the context of everybody else's data and hypothesize diet changes, whatever, and see how that changed their biomarkers based upon what your predictions have put forth, people can have much greater control over their health. I mean, did you see what I'm saying? In other words, you just if somehow a person had access to their data and it was open source, the other data, de-identified, all that stuff, but you could set up a game, and that would and have almost immediate feedback in terms of how someone could take corrective action.
So I'll make 3 points and ask Jennifer to jump in. One, spoken like a pure scientist. So I love that that would be a perfect product for you. What we're focused on is looking at 3 different archetypes of personalities. One are health hopefuls. So health hopefuls are late 30s plus, health scare somewhere within their frame of reference. They realize this aging thing's real and they're not too happy about it. And they're buying the Fitbits and the other data, but because no one's coaching them with what to do with the data, even 10,000 steps means nothing to them. The second thing, we're actually trying some of what you're doing, and Jennifer can speak to it, where on the dashboard we'll go through and say, let's see what might be the impact of changing the number of sugary drinks, changing the number of exercise in terms of the outcomes. And so we're doing some early tests with that. Third, in the consumer space, because I invested there for a decade, what I saw is that so many entrepreneurs would come and have these extraordinary, highly engaging apps. And so then I'd follow the companies, and we couldn't see that the apps by themselves were actually driving behavior change if there wasn't a human component to it. And so having coaching is really heavy lifting, extraordinarily expensive, but Jim, we're highly aligned with your concept of how do we make the coaches more efficient, and how do we make them more omnipresent and more impactful? And we think the idea of bringing gamification and making data actionable is a big piece of that.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing some tests right now with things where people can actually sort of make some changes and see what it might do. There are two challenges. Clayton already alluded to one, and that is that most consumers really are not interested in playing with their data. In fact, they really just want to be told what to do. To improve their health. And so it's hard sometimes even for the coaches to get them to engage in dialogue and take the kind of, the ownership of their own life and their own wellness, because it's, we're sort of indoctrinated in this culture, and, partly because of the medical system, of just tell me what I need to do. What pill do I need to take? What supplement do I need to take? And so the idea of even having that level of ownership, let alone going to the next level, which you're talking about, of playing with the data and understanding it. So that's one challenge with the consumer side. The second challenge is that it's actually it's more difficult than one might expect to find the correlations that could actually be used to drive that sort of gamification, particularly with all the different wellness components that we deal with. We have people dealing with everything from managing a chronic disease, optimizing nutrition, optimizing sleep, and there's relatively few things, and we found this with the tests that we're doing right now on our dashboard, where we could say, yes, if there's evidence that if you move this marker, if you reduce your sugary drink intake, you are likely to get a change in this other thing. We can look in our 3,000 to 4,000, but that's a pretty small population to be doing that sort of correlation, and many other things just simply haven't been studied. So lack of data, lack of consumer interest, potentially, although we're testing that, would be the two challenges.
I guess my thinking is that you would, if you had this type of availability, even to geeks like myself, you would have a lot of inventing around this concept that would bring in a tremendous amount of benefit and acceleration to the basic idea. And you're not paying for it. You're basically just doing it by engagement of people that have a deep interest in, being a wellness geek or something like that. I guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, you guys are converted, but other people
Right. Yeah.
would want to play.
Actually, in a way, I can extend on Jim's question. So I loved Clayton's example. All of them, they are really talking, I think, to everyone's experience, trying to change their behavior, certain things. But for instance, you were a wellness-conscious person, and you changed paleo, then you saw your blood glucose increasing. So you knew your baseline, you knew exactly what you were eating and what is the effect. So my question is, when we are trying to personalize nutrition now to improve health outcomes, how much the digital tools have helped you really to personalize nutrition, to identify what components are important for every one of those, and how you track adherence in what the coach, for instance? Because I think we will not be able to gamify and really explore the data if we don't have this information, at least.
Yeah, no, those are two really good points. Having been a nutrition researcher for a very long time, I can say that the ability to quantify nutritional intake is kind of the holy grail of nutrition. It is very, very difficult to actually get any meaningful quantification of what people are really putting in their mouths. And so, like many other very smart people, we haven't, cracked that. What's interesting is the app that we use that Clayton showed you does allow people to take pictures of their food and send that picture to their coach. Now, there's absolutely no quantification there. We're not trying to turn that image into a estimate of nutrient content, which there are apps that, companies that are trying to figure out how to do that, and that would be terrific if we could. But it's simply the idea of tracking, I have taken this food, I've taken a picture, I've gone to the extra step of sending that to my coach, and the coach can kind of give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. This fits, I think, with what you're trying to work on, or it doesn't. And right now we're doing some analyses to actually see what that does to compliance and to outcomes, whether just simply the act of tracking the food through a picture is going to be associated with greater compliance or greater outcomes. So we don't have the answer yet, but our research team is diligently working on that as we speak for a manuscript that we're getting ready to submit. So I think the digital tools are supportive, but not as quantifiable as we would like. And then in terms of compliance, it is difficult, particularly given the range of behaviors that we're looking at. So for weight loss, where we know that food tracking is very important, and I can tell somebody who's working on weight loss that there is good evidence that if you track your food, and studies after, multiple studies have shown that people lose anywhere from 2 to 3 times more weight when they track their food than when they don't track their food. That's a big motivator for people behaviorally to say, oh, okay, I can say that there's going to be a payoff for me if I go through the bother of tracking my food, which is never anybody's most fun thing to do. But for other types of wellness goals, we don't have that kind of data. We don't necessarily have the data that if you go in and check off that you're taking your supplements or check off on other things, that's necessarily going to be tied to greater outcomes. So that's something that we hope to learn over time, but that's part of the challenge with really getting detailed information on compliance right now, is that for the individual member, if they're not working on weight loss, where's the payoff in doing that? So we're working on it to see what we can get.
I would just add a couple of things. One, there are some key molecules that if we could follow their levels in the blood, like glucose, you could really do incredible experiments as you ate your meals, as you fasted, all sorts of things. And there are digital devices that are just barely beginning to do this, but they're not routine. I would say number 2, being able to measure complex phenotypes that I mentioned in my talk, heart rate variability, and that's really interesting because it integrates 2 nervous systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And what is fascinating about heart rate variability, and all that is the variation between each beat length, how much you vary from one to the next. What that does in fascinating ways is has incredible correlations with general health that people observe for many years. And there are devices that do that out there, and I'd love to see that come in. And the example I showed you of pulse changing during that 2-week period when I have a cold, pulse in another sense is an integrated complex assay that is a result of a lot of different things. And if you have other data, you can really make striking observations about what pulse changes make. So I think these digital devices are going to be really important for adding data in the future, but we're just at the beginning of a point where we can use them effectively in the way you'd like to see them used.
Yeah, I completely agree. The way to get compliance with tracking and knowing what's going on is actually to make it completely passive, like that. So things are just being measured where the user themselves, they don't have to click, they don't have to punch, they don't even have to swipe. It just knows.
And with the Fitbit, you can just do a little click, and boom, you get your pulse for the last month. And you can look and see at that variation and what it correlates with. And, the striking thing is those little blips that correlated with high airplane flights. And I'm sure there are all sorts of other correlations that one can find too.
First part of my question is fun. Jennifer, how on earth did you deal with such a bad compliant person that you're sitting opposite, who clearly doesn't go to sleep at the right time?
Doesn't go to sleep at the right time.
What is the cognitive strategy?
So we have, our coaches actually are extensively trained in behavioral science. We use sort of a toolbox approach for a variety of things that they can use. Motivational interviewing would be one, so Clayton mentioned his motivation about, being a great CEO and doing well in the triathlon. So, a coach can give some pretty good clues around that. We use cognitive behavioral strategies. We use mindfulness a lot because a lot of wellness is simply being aware of what you are doing from moment to moment and making a conscious decision rather than an unconscious decision around things. So there are literally 6 or 7 specific behavioral and cognitive tools that the coaches are trained to use in different settings with different people as appropriate.
Okay, so here's my serious part of the question. In real life, in patients who are becoming quite elderly, where they often have several diseases, perhaps up to 3, 4, it becomes increasingly difficult to be compliant. And you might or might not know that Tom Kirkwood in the UK, in Newcastle, who's the assistant dean there, who is one of an international longevitist, has got a group of elderly people who are between the ages of about 75 and 90, where, of course, you can't necessarily expect them to be compliant. They have diseases, they try and adapt to them, as he has shown in his work. But the real crux of my question is, do you have, or are you intending to get the sorts of cognitive structures to deal with that sort of more elderly population where illness is already in the equation?
Yeah, and in a couple ways. I mean, we do have a fair number of people in the program already who fall into that designation. And if you recall yesterday, Lee showed the slide of the wellness staircase. And so when we're talking about individuals who have multiple chronic diseases on top of whatever natural effects of aging might be going on, they may be at a different place on that wellness staircase than an individual who is a competitive triathlete or, one of our people who is in their early 20s and really just wanting to understand what they can do to age well and avoid the diseases that their parents might have had. So to some extent, it is matching the cognitive and behavioral intervention to the person and what they can actually work with and what their goals are. We do a lot of work that is simply helping people deal with kind of the back end of managing their medical condition. And what I mean by that is they've got their healthcare team, their physicians who are helping them to manage their disease and their medications, but often in the short time that one has to chat with one's physician, you can't necessarily talk about sleep issues or stress or, I'd like to take this, I know I should take this medication, but I have to take it with food, but I have another, all of those kinds of things where if there's a good patient advocate or nurse advocate, they can do that sort of role, but many times people don't have that. And so the coaches will help people to really be advocates for themselves and figure out what they need within that system. And that can be a very helpful and supportive role. But yeah, we are continuing to develop things with the Alzheimer's trial also that Clayton mentioned, which we're just beginning. Those are individuals who not only in many cases have multiple chronic diseases, but they are also experiencing fairly, even though it's early stage, still pretty significant cognitive decline where they can kind of only deal with one very specific task at a time and may need frequent reminders about that as well. And so we're working with that. But I firmly believe that wherever anyone is on that wellness staircase, that it's possible to optimize wellness. Maybe not to get up multiple rungs, but to get to more of what you want to do and those experiences that you want to have in your life, whatever your age.
A final question.
Why not New York?
New York is a nightmare from a regulatory perspective, and so they have a body that we are going through the process of the application, which takes about 1.5 years for a consumer company to be able to provide genomic information. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the opportunity to have this conversation and present to you. Lee, is this the wrap-up of the conference? I'm not sure.
No, I think this has been a good wrap-up.
Okay.
Good. So thank you for coming. Come back again next year. It'll be a great conference then as well.
And take the card.